Hello everyone. Sadly I couldn't be with you today, so I've pre-recorded my talk. I'm sure I've just had an utterly splendid and profoundly flattering introduction, so I'm not going to repeat any of it. My talk today is entitled Safety in TIVA, Errors and Solutions, because I can't help it but to include puns wherever possible. I hope you enjoy it. Hopefully, over the rest of my talk, I'm going to cover some of the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about error when using TIVA and ask, is there a problem? Because I believe there is. Hopefully, I'm going to illustrate this to you with some anecdotes and some regional surveys and with some national audit data. I'm then going to go wildly off on a tangent and talk a little bit about roads, railway lines and Norman doors. Hopefully you'll understand why as I do so. And then I'm going to talk about potential solutions to solving some of those errors. What can we do about it? What does good design look like? And introduce some potential temporary solutions. This talk, as with all of my talks, contains pictures, diagrams, graphs and opinions. Hopefully where things are just my opinion, it will be obvious on the slide. I'm going to start today's session with a book recommendation. This book, The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, is an excellent book with an awful lot to say about patient safety, although not necessarily presented that way. This book talks an awful lot about what we would call human factors and ergonomics, but primarily from the vantage point of a designer. It says good design is actually a lot harder to notice than poor design, in part because good design fits our needs so well that design is invisible, serving us without drawing attention to itself. Bad design, on the other hand, screams out its inadequacies, making itself very noticeable. I would say that what we would talk about in terms of human factors and ergonomics often really relates to design, and I would say an awful lot of the equipment that we currently use for TIVA is not adequately designed. It doesn't prevent error, which means that those errors highlight themselves wherever we look for them. As an illustration of what bad design looks like, Don Norman uses the example of a Norman door, and a Norman door is any door that requires an explanation. It should be obvious when you approach a door whether or not you're supposed to pull it or push it, and if the door has to tell you what to do, that door is poorly designed. Good design means things should be intuitive. They should just work without you having to think too hard about them. Before we go any further, I should probably clarify what I mean by TIVA for the rest of the talk. So obviously there are an awful lot of ways of delivering anaesthesia in a totally intravenous fashion. And when I'm talking about TIVA in the rest of the talk, I'm describing, as I imagine most of us would, anaesthesia using a combination of propofol and remifentanil delivered with target controlled infusions. So, is there a safety problem or safety problems associated with using total intravenous anaesthesia at the moment? And I believe that there is, and probably the single biggest piece of evidence that we have for this was published almost 10 years ago now, which is NAP5, the fifth National Audit Project of the Royal College of Anaesthetists and the Association of Anaesthetists. In NAP5, which looked at cases of accidental awareness during general anaesthesia, TIVA accounted for only 8% of general anaesthetics, but for 18% of cases of accidental awareness. And one of the key headline findings from that report was that failure to ensure delivery of the intended anaesthetic dose was an important cause of accidental awareness under general anaesthetic when using total intravenous anaesthesia. Very helpfully, the NAP5 report then went on to illustrate a number of the ways in which it's possible to currently get TIVA wrong. So this nice table featured in the section on total intravenous anaesthesia, talking about how at the moment there are a number of ways in which you may not ensure delivery of the intended anaesthetic dose. And if you aren't ensuring the intended delivery of the anaesthetic dose, almost by definition, you may not therefore provide adequate anaesthesia for the patient you're looking after. The NAP5 report then went on to make multiple recommendations, largely about trying to reduce the likelihood of error when using total intravenous anaesthesia. One of those recommendations was that the national bodies should get their heads together and create a national guideline to standardise some of our practice when using total intravenous anaesthesia. It took a couple of years to happen, but that's exactly what SIVA and the association did with the publication of this guideline in 2019. To the best of our knowledge, this was the first national or international guideline on the safe practice of total intravenous anaesthesia, and it consisted of a list of 10 recommendations, again largely designed to standardise practice and reduce the likelihood of making an error or a mistake. At this point though, I should probably make a confession. My interest in the topic of safety in TIVA occurred because I myself made an error when using total intravenous anaesthesia. And when I reached out to colleagues, whether or not they were aware of this guideline, several others had made errors, including the same error that I had made. And it occurred to me that perhaps the guideline wasn't necessarily having the impact that we would want it to have. And I wondered if that was the case just within my department or whether that was the case within the region. So I decided to undertake a survey to find out. My regional survey therefore sought to find out what current practice was and whether it was in line with the guidelines that had been published earlier on that year. I wanted to find out what errors people were making or had made or were still making, and whether or not those errors had actual patient consequences. So I surveyed 8 trusts within the East Midlands over a period of a few months. I got quite a nice spread of responses. I got 180 responses overall, covering 8 trusts, which I think probably means a response rate of around about 1 in 3, which I don't think is bad. It covered a nice spread of respondees. It covered consultants, SAS doctors, and doctors in formal training at various stages of their career. I also got quite a nice spread of responses in terms of frequency of TIVA use. So the single biggest peak within the responses was people who use TIVA sometimes. So about 40% use TIVA some of the times, and defined that as less than 20% of the time. We also got responses from people who never use TIVA, right through to people who use TIVA either always or almost always. So hopefully a fairly representative sample. Interestingly, this reflects perhaps a greater use in the East Midlands by 2019 than had been found in the NAP5 survey in 2013 and 2014. Typical anaesthetists in the East Midlands in 2019 used TIVA for around about 20% of their cases. Respondents also reported practice that was largely in keeping with the guidelines. So most people did something that looked like the TIVA that I was giving or the TIVA that you might be using. 90% reported that they've been educated on the use of TIVA, and 70%, almost 70%, reported that they've been educated on the use of processed EEG. Speaking about processed EEG, the use of processed EEG was an awful lot greater than was suggested by the national guidelines. So 64% of people using TIVA said that they always use processed EEG when using TIVA, which again was in line with my practice and what I would consider to be normal practice within my department at the time. This is the point where we get to the bit that I think is really, really interesting though. So despite what I would consider to be relatively good adherence to the national guidelines, more than 85%, so 87% of respondents reported making or witnessing an error or issue when using total intravenous anaesthesia. Obviously, these are proportions of respondents rather than proportions of patients receiving total intravenous anaesthesia before anyone becomes horrified, but the majority of people who use TIVA had in some way at some point gotten it wrong. And I think that's quite a significant take-home message. Anyone who makes a mistake might assume that they are the only person who's ever made that error, or that they are in some way deficient as an anaesthetist because they have erred. My regional survey, which I was very surprised by how honest people were, my regional survey would suggest that the majority of the errors have occurred to multiple people, and therefore these are issues in need of a system solution. For anyone who's interested, the top most common errors or issues related to the following. So the most common, with almost 50% of respondents reporting it had happened to them, was pump battery failure. So if your pump fails in the middle of an anaesthetic, you are by definition no longer necessarily delivering the anaesthetic that you intended to deliver. Cannula failure, induction or in theatre was more common perhaps than we would like it to be. Pump drug mismatching, so putting your remifentanil into the pump program for propofol or vice versa, pump misprogramming, so having the wrong patient details or an unintended protocol, you having an issue with your giving set, either not primed or not connected or clamped, and drug concentration error, so either the incorrect concentration within the syringe or the drug not added to the syringe, and remifentanil on the side while you deliver a syringe full of saline or water for injections was certainly reported within the survey. For completeness, I also asked whether or not people had had any consequences resulting from their errors. Now, I imagine that the consequences are the tip of the iceberg relative to the number of errors that occur. And again, I asked people to be honest, and they were. So 22% of respondents had had an unintentionally deep anaesthetic without apparent harm relating to an error or an issue made while using total intravenous anaesthesia. A smaller group, 5%, had had apparent or potential for harm, so hypotension or bradycardia associated with an unintentionally deep anaesthetic. 25% reported an unintentionally light anaesthetic resulting from an error or issue when using total intravenous anaesthesia, and again a smaller number reported an unintentionally light anaesthetic with the potential for harm, so hypertension or tachycardia, for example. 26% of respondents had to convert to an alternate means of providing anaesthesia because of an error or an issue when using TIVA, and 3 respondents in my survey reported having had cases of accidental awareness during anaesthesia, and again this is as was reflected within the NAP5 report. Unbeknownst to me, at the same time that I was carrying out my survey, these two fine gentlemen, Doctors Peck and Cutler, working in the Wessex region, were also undertaking a similar survey. They had marginally more respondents than me. I'm very jealous. Again, covering 8 hospitals within their region, and they found comparable errors and comparable error rates to the errors that I had found. So wrong drug errors, wrong concentration errors, wrong propofol or opioid mixing errors were reported in their survey as well. This isn't just happening in the East Midlands or Wessex. I suspect if you were to carry out a survey like this anywhere in the country, you would find, if you ask people to be honest, that they have indeed made some errors when using total intravenous anaesthesia. And this is where I stray off at a tangent into interesting analogies again. So why is this happening? Why is it that we might be seeing issues associated with TIVA that aren't necessarily associated with using volatile anaesthetics? And again, I quite like this analogy. So anywhere that you have a road and a railway line that meet one another, there is the possibility of a collision. And the likelihood of that collision is determined largely by the amount of trains and the amount of cars that meet at that level crossing. In remote areas where there are few trains and few cars, you may have very few safety features to prevent a collision because a collision isn't very likely. Where there are more cars and more trains, you might start to introduce some safety features, including level crossing. So these might, in some areas, have passive safety features, just signs and road markings. As things get a little bit busier, you might put in some active safety features. You might have audible warnings, traffic lights when the trains are approaching. You may have barriers that come down. Depending on the frequency in the trains and the road users and the location, your collision rate can be reduced. But again, it may still be possible for a collision to occur, and these things all still require a bit of vigilance. Even barriers can be worked around, and cars may find themselves in between the barriers while a train is approaching. And I would say that kind of comparable things within our working lives are things like stop before you block, or perhaps stop block, or the WHO surgical safety checklist. These things reduce the likelihood of error, but they still require human engagement, they still require vigilance, they can be worked around, and therefore error remains possible. If you really want to make error impossible, what you actually need is a bridge. You need something that means the train goes over the top and the road goes underneath, or vice versa, which means that these two things happen largely oblivious to one another. And in most of our medical practice, certainly within anaesthesia, we are surrounded by these kinds of things all the time. We just don't necessarily notice them. This is reflected in the excellent recent association guideline on human factors in anaesthetic practice. That at one end of the scale, you can reduce the likelihood of error with a little bit of education, but I think most people recognise that education still has a little bit too much reliance on human beings. And actually, the best things you can do to reduce the likelihood of error are system design. They are system focused, especially good design and forcing functions, which basically make error impossible, much like your bridge going over the top of the road with a train going over the top of you. This takes me back to my book recommendation from the beginning of the talk. Now, Don Norman talks about design and the design of everyday things, and a crucial message in the first chapter of that book is that humans err continually. It's an intrinsic part of our nature, and that good system design should take this into account. And pinning the blame on the person may be a comfortable way to proceed, but why was the system ever designed so that a single act by a single person could cause calamity? Worse, blaming the person without fixing the root underlying cause doesn't fix the problem. The same error is likely to be repeated by someone else. And again, I would say that my survey, the Wessex survey and NAT5 all illustrate that human beings are making these same mistakes when using total intravenous anaesthesia. We need system solutions. Education will only take us so far. As Don Norman says, we have to accept human behaviour the way it is, not the way that we would wish it to be. And these kinds of system-based solutions, these kinds of forcing functions are actually all around us in anaesthetics, especially when we're using a volatile anaesthetic. Iterations of anaesthetic machines have been re-engineered and redesigned to reduce the likelihood of human error. Anything foolish that we were once able to do has basically been engineered out in a way that we don't even realise that it's happening anymore. And these are the things, these safety features are things that we all learn for the primary FRCA or equivalent. They include things like colour coding of pipes and valves and cylinders and displays, non-interchangeable Schrader sockets and collars, non-interchangeable screw threads and connectors, pin index system for cylinders, the chain link between oxygen and nitrous oxide on our rotameters, oxygen failure warning, rotameter knob size and position, individual calibration of rotameters, colour coding, vaporizers, bottles, the key fill system, and all of the engineering that goes into vaporizers so that when you turn on 2% sevoflurane in a 50-50 air oxygen mix, that's exactly what's going to come out of the common gas outlet. And when you compare that to what we currently have as our setup for total intravenous anaesthesia, to my mind anyway, it becomes quite obvious why error might be associated with TIVA. There are just an extraordinarily large number of ways to get it wrong. Before every case, we have to do drug preparation, we have to do drug dilution, we have to program our pumps. Our two pumps may look completely identical to one another, and they will do exactly what we tell them to do. They are pluripotent. They will allow you to program a pump that contains a syringe with propofol in it for remifentanil or vice versa. They will do precisely what they are told to do, even when it's silly. Our anaesthetic machines work around human fallibility, but our TIVA pumps don't. Going back to our analogy of roads and railway lines in the countryside, where there are very few cars and where there are very few trains, you may get away with few safety features. However, the NAP7 activity survey that was published earlier on this year has demonstrated that we are now indeed using 3 times as much TIVA nationally as we were during the NAP5 activity survey. The amount of total intravenous anaesthesia that we're using has increased threefold, and I think that means that we need better safety solutions. We need more engineering. So what can we do about error when we're using TIVA? Well, in my opinion, the ideal solutions would use equipment design to make doing the right thing the easiest thing while making some of these errors impossible. That's what good design would look like when it comes to TIVA. Longer term solutions involve industry and therefore might include things like pre-filled syringes of standardized concentrations to remove the possibility of concentration errors, non-interchangeable syringe and pump matching to remove the possibility of someone delivering remifentanil using a model that was designed for propofol. They might include things like wristband barcode pump programming so that we don't have to remember our patient demographics and we don't have to transfer patient demographics into a pump. It's done for us. Those of us old enough to remember using total intravenous anaesthesia might remember dip diffusers. So there was once upon a time it was impossible to deliver remifentanil using a pump that was designed for propofol. But again, we are in the situation that we are now where we have pumps that will deliver multiple agents, and perhaps we need to move away from that. Shorter term solutions though are likely to involve some kind of checklist or prompt. This is one step up from education, but perhaps not as good as engineered forcing functions. Perhaps we need a stop before you block for TIVA. With that in mind, this was my solution, kind of a homage to stop before you block. This is peruse before you infuse, and this is what I use. Peruse before you infuse is designed as a mnemonic or a checklist for use before pressing go on the pumps. Ideally, it should be a 2-person positive confirmatory check before starting the infusions to make sure that you have in fact set up your kit the way you intended to. It involves checking that your propofol is in the syringe and is in the pump that's programmed for propofol. It involves checking your empty ampules to make sure that you've got the right concentrations and that you haven't made any dilution errors, making sure that you've put your remifentanil into the remifentanil syringe. It involves checking that remifentanil syringe has then made its way into the pump that's programmed for remifentanil. It involves a quick final check of your user settings to make sure that you've got your patient demographics entered correctly, patient characteristics rather, entered correctly into the pumps. It involves a quick final check of your setup and giving set, making sure that you are connected at both ends, primed, your drip is running, your cannula is visible. And it involves avoiding that thing that we found to be the most common error, making sure that you've actually got an adequate amount of charge on the pump to press go and you've got some means of charging the pumps during the anaesthetic. And peruse before you infuse, alongside the survey data that led to me creating it, were both published in Anaesthesia News in July 2020. Those posters, version 1.5 of the poster, is available to download from both the Association of Anaesthetists and the SIVA websites, although it's not formally endorsed yet by either organisation. It's been circulated to all the patient safety leads by SALG about 18 months ago. And I keep a stash of printed posters, and I'm very happy to send posters out to anyone who wants one. So to the best of my knowledge, that Peruse Before You Infuse is now in use in more than 20 trusts in the UK. I think I'm on my 4th print run, and each time I have them printed I have several hundred made. So to summarise, error when using TIVA. Is there a problem? Well, hopefully over the course of the last 20 slides or so I've convinced you that there is. And why is this happening? Well, this is happening because human beings are fallible and the systems that we have in place aren't yet adequate. And what can we do about it? Well, better designed pumps would be a very good start, and I would kind of hope that the patient safety community would encourage the manufacturers of TIVA pumps and TIVA equipment to up their game a little, and to make the next generation of TIVA pumps a little bit better designed to engineer some of this error out. Until that occurs though, we probably need something to check our working in a standardised way, and by all means come up with your own solutions, but I would say I would be very happy to send any of you posters or for you to use peruse before you infuse as your solution. Thank you very much for having me today.